everyone, welcome to my video about swatching for gauge. My name is Erin Gates. I am the owner of Three Birds Yarn Studio and the designer behind Lizzie Knits. In today's video, I want to talk about checking for gauge. Why do we check for gauge? How to make a gauge swatch. So let's get started. We're going to go over the basics, and hopefully if you are unfamiliar with swatching for gauge or a little intimidated by it, if you're a new knitter, hopefully I can clear a few things up. And basically I want to explain what is the point of checking for gauge. So first, what is it? It's a little sample test knit that you make before you cast on the project for real. So basically, and when you read a pattern, there's going to be a section that says gauge. Here it's going to give you two numbers, the stitches, the rows, and then it'll give you a measurement of how our sample size, like sometimes it's over a 4" by 4" square, sometimes it's a 2 by 2. I've got a few swatches here. Your gauge is going to tell you and instruct you what stitch to do it in. Usually it's worked in stockinette stitch. That's kind of like the basic, like do a little swatch in stockinette. But you might see in a pattern, I have one in ribbing. You might have a pattern for your gauge, like in whatever design you're going to be using in the main pattern. So it's just a tester to see if you knit the same as the designer. That's the whole point. We all knit differently. So let's say I'm writing a pattern and I knit. I have my own style of knitting. And actually I tend to knit a little on the looser side. So if you want to make the same exact pattern as me, you use the needles that I use. But if you knit tight, your hat or your garment, it's not gonna be the same as what I made. So what we wanna do is make sure that you knit the same as the person who wrote the pattern. Then the sizing will be the same. And there's a couple different reasons. There's different variables of how you might get a different stitch size than someone else. You know, the way you hold tension when you knit. Or another big one is if you want to use a different yarn. So even though a pattern might call for I use this specific yarn, worsted weight, and you're like, well, I want to use a different worsted weight. But you know, each brand of yarn could vary a little bit. So we want to make sure that you are getting the same end product as the person who designed the pattern. Okay, I'm gonna switch the camera and I'm gonna show you a few examples I have going on of some swatches and how it looks when you're reading a pattern. Okay, so before you begin your gauge swatch or you got your new pattern that you're ready to start, there's like different sections in the pattern in the beginning, you know, materials, here's gauge, finished measurements, abbreviations. This is one of my patterns. So this is kind of how I set up my designs. So here's a gauge section. So I'm gonna tell you what I did and what size my stitches are. So I'm for this example, this is US 15 needles because that's what we're gonna use in the pattern. So they'll tell you what needles to use. And then I say that it's going to be measured over a 4 by 4" square. Okay, and then if you measure 4 inches, you should count 9 stitches and 13 rows. Another thing, I always say whether you needs to be blocked or not and what stitch pattern the swatch should be in. Some patterns do not include this. So I would say as a side note, do stockinette stitch if it is not noted, and use your best judgment on whether it's supposed to be blocked or not. I would say like if you're making a hat, you probably don't have to block your swatch because most hats don't get blocked. At least I don't block mine. But if you're doing like a sweater or a shawl that you know your end product is going to be blocked, you should block your swatch as well. So, you know, block, get it wet, pin it down, and then when it dries, then take your stitch measurement because yarn acts differently. Once it's wet, it blooms, it can stretch, you know, all that good stuff. So to get a very accurate measurement. Okay, but for this one, this is a hat pattern, it's super bulky, and I'm saying you don't have to bother blocking it. Okay, so here's what I did. Here's the swatch that I made. And I know that I'm going to try to get 9 stitches across. So, but what I do, I cast it on a couple more than 9 stitches. Every time I do a gauge swatch, like, cause It might fluctuate a little bit, but also these ends kind of curl a little bit, you know, when you're just doing stockinette. So I always just kind of, I'm sorry, the camera keeps shaking. I always add on like 4 more stitches or 5 more than what the gauge is saying, just to have a little edge. All right, so let's count here. My swatch says I have a little ruler here that I use for everything, but this little tool is like, you can use any ruler or tape measure. Okay, mine says I want 9 stitches across for 4 inches. Let's count. I want to line up the ruler to like the start of a stitch. Okay, so there's the start of that one. Kind of make it straight. Okay, so I have that stitch is the beginning of it, and then it stops at 4 inches, so I'll count to here. So let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Sweet, I got gauge. All right, well, let's check the height. So now it says for that same 4-inch measurement, I should have 13 rows. So I want to count 13 stitches up. So let's find a start of a stitch and oops. All right, so I'll say that that's gonna start like at this stitch right here, 4 inches, and end around probably that one. All right, give or take. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13, okay, 13 and a half. I'm gonna call it that, yes, I'm off by half a stitch. It really is okay. And also too, you might wanna pick a couple different spots in your pattern, because if you can see, I mean, my stitches aren't perfect. I mean, it's hard. They're pretty consistent, but they're not like 100% exact in sizing. So, you know, you can measure your 4 inches in a couple different places just to kind of get an average. So yeah, you can try the width. Just if you feel like you mismeasured, and you just try a different spot to get like a real accurate, and then just take like the average. Okay, so I had 9 stitches across. Where are we? 9 stitches across, and then I had like 13.5 rows. It's fine. I will consider that getting gauge. Okay, here's an alternative. Though, let's say you do not get gauge. So I measure 4, and I have like, let's say I have like 12 stitches across. That means I have more stitches in here, and that means my stitches are smaller because I fit more into a 4-inch area. So if I have too many stitches when I'm measuring, that means I'm knitting too tight. So I do not knit the same as the designer. So if I'm knitting tight, my garment is going to come out small. So what you need to do, and this will go for, let's say I'm knitting too loose and you don't have as many stitches. Okay, then you're knitting too loose. You need to size down a needle. Okay, back to, I knit too tight. I have too many stitches. I need to gauge swatch again. All right, and this can get tedious, like this in reality, like it can, but you know, it's very crucial to having a success in completing a pattern and having the final product measure what you want to. So what I would do I'm gonna re-swatch, because I know that I was knitting too small, so I'm gonna go up a needle size. Well, there's not really any after 15, but let's say these were US 9, this swatch was for US 9. I'm gonna swatch again with US 10 and see if I get gauge with that size needle. And if I do, and then I'm back, okay, I do one size bigger, and then I got the correct measurements, then you know for this pattern, you're gonna use the other needle size for the whole project, okay? And this is something, especially with like beginner knitters, it's okay to use a different size needles than what is recommended. Because this really is, like your materials were saying, we're going to use these size needles. But if you're knitting too tight or too loose, you have to adjust your needles so your stitches are the same as the person who designed the pattern. So instead, it is very common. These are a suggestion. This is the designer saying, well, this is what I use to get this final product. So then the gauge test, what do you use to get the final project? Okay, so just keep, if you're new to knitting, this is a key thing. Needles can always be adjusted because you want to have the correct size stitches. Okay, And I set, same, you could size down if your stitches were too big. Like if I had not enough stitches, I would go down to like US 13 and try a swatch again. Another thing, let's say you do 2 swatches and you're like, okay, I did the 2 sizes. I tried, and now you're landing somewhere in the middle, of your measurements, and that's gonna happen. That is common. You might not get the gauge exactly, but the point is to really do your best. So let's say your measurements are in between, just go with the one that is a little closer. Another thing is if you are off just like by a tiny bit on your stitches or sizing, and like you're a little tight, just, maybe you don't have to change needles. You can just say that I'm gonna try to knit a little looser on this hat. Like just make like minor adjustments, because all this sizing issues is really just a judgment call. So do your best, especially if your numbers are not like landing exactly as it's stated in the pattern. Just go with whatever's closer. All right, so that was stockinette. This was a basic, but I did get I did get gauge for this, so I know that I'm good using the same needles that is stated in the pattern, but you switch according to your own knitting tension. Okay, I wanna show, and I generally, gauge swatches are knit flat, okay? And I would say if the pattern does not call for knit flat or in the round, I would just assume that it's knit flat, like I didn't note in my pattern. But there are designs that say swatch in the round. All right, I have another pattern here that I'm currently working on. I'm writing this one up. In this one, this is a hat, and I said, I want this gauge in stockinette stitch, I cannot say that, but worked in the round. And this is what I did. And we do this because it will mimic your project. Like your project is worked in the round, okay? Like, sweater, you're gonna work a sweater in the round. So makes sense to swatch in the round, because when you knit in the round versus knitting flat, you're only doing one side facing outwards, so your stitches actually would come out different. Usually, most people's would come out a little different. Okay, and so I did a little test swatch. It's a little tube here, and I did it on double pointed needles. And I'm saying, instead of like a 4-inch square, like the last pattern I showed you, this one we're doing with a 2-inch here. Okay, so it's a smaller little test area. Great, as long as it'll always tell you how big to make the test area. So this one's smaller. All right, I'm ready to measure. And actually what I'm doing with this yarn is I'm trying to see if I can substitute this yarn as one of these suggested ones in the pattern. So cross our fingers. I'm hoping to. Also, this is really pretty. This is Wool and the Gang El Pacino Merino. Okay, now it's time to measure. I am doing a 2-inch by 2-inch. You know what, I'm just gonna take these out, because honestly, after I measure, I'm gonna unravel this anyways and then use it for my project when I get started. Okay, I want a 2 by 2. Let's see here, 2 inches, 2 inches. Okay, and I want 6 stitches across. Where are we? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I got like 6.5. All right. Well, let's see if I get something different on the other side. I'm going to measure a couple times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. So it's more like 6.5, 7 instead of 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's a little closer to 6. All right. So I'm in between 6 and 7 on the stitches for, even though I said it was 6. And let's measure height. And now we want 9.5 rows. All right, I'll line that up. We got 2-inch, okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.5. That's perfect. I'm going to do it one more time on the other side, just see if we get the same amount before I put this into the pattern. All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 9.5-ish. Okay, so I was spot on with my rows in this yarn. And you know, it's a little like a half a stitch higher for the stitch measurement, but you know what? I'm gonna call this fine. I'll say it's a winner because like if you fluctuate by like 1 stitch, like I wouldn't sweat it. Okay, so well, now I'm done with that. Good, now I know that I'm gonna add this to the pattern as a suggested. Now I can cast on my hat and it should come out the same. Okay, I think that about covers it for gauge. Gauge is very important. So I really highly recommend just taking that little extra step, because especially if you're making like a sock weight shawl or really a sweater, which is very, very time consuming, you do not want to cast on a sweater without checking gauge first. Please, 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 because you'll be very disappointed in the end if it comes out not like it was supposed to, or too small, too big. So please take those few extra minutes, maybe 20 minutes, and check the gauge, and you will be much happier with your final product. Okay, everyone, that covers it. Thank you so much for watching. Happy knitting.